Hey, solopreneurs, Gabe here. Today we have a special guest by the name of Mr. Mark Travis, who happens to be a freelance writer for a company called Scribe. And that's the company that I hired to do my book. And he is my ghostwriter. It's a fantastic conversation, and I can't wait for you to hear it. Mark, thank you for being on the podcast.
Hey, Gabe. I'm glad to be here. It's great. It's great to hang out again. It's been a while.
It has been a little while, and for those that are listening, this is a exciting episode for me because this is where I get to introduce the guy who wrote my book. Is a ghostwriter writing in my voice, and he did an amazing job. And as we were starting to go through the whole process, I was thinking, all right, I got to have Mark on my podcast. I got to have him share the story and share the whole process that we went through in setting this whole thing up and producing the Solopreneurs Money Manifesto. But before we go there, I gotta hear your story, Mark. So what brings you from starting out in life all the way to now? Here we are on a podcast together, and you are a ghostwriter helping me write my book. So what's your story?
Well, it's been a journey, but it started with, I think as a kid, I loved reading. As a teenager, I realized I liked writing. It really dawned on me the day I wrote something for an English class in high school. The teacher read it aloud, and I was making fun of his physical appearance. And the cheerleader who was sitting next to me laughed out loud. And I thought, oh, if I can get a cheerleader to laugh at something I wrote, I should, I want to write. Um, but the foundation was really laid. 25 years I spent as a newspaper journalist, most of them as a reporter, some as an editor. Um, and I used to tell people, I went to college, but it wasn't really till that first morning in a newsroom that I learned to think, because to be a reporter, you've got to listen to people carefully. You've got to learn to ask good questions. You've got to learn to think on your feet and process what you're hearing. Um, you got to learn to write fast, and it really hones your curiosity. I mean, if you don't enjoy meeting people, if you're not enjoying learning things, you're not going to succeed as a reporter. And so that really set me up for this. I spent 10 years over on the business side because in the early 2000s, it became clear that the internet was the big challenge for local newspapers, which is where I worked. I wanted to be part of fixing that, an effort in which I failed, as as have most local newspapers. But it taught me a lot about business. Um, I ended up being a publisher of a couple newspapers, so I was responsible for the kinds of decisions business people make. Um, and after that, I spent 5 years at a tech startup, so that introduced me to that world, and that way of thinking. Uh, I left shortly before, maybe a year before the startup failed, and at that point was in my early 60s, and wanted to get back to where I began. I wanted to get back to writing. So I decided to try freelance writing. And pretty soon, someone recommended Scribe to me. And I went through their application process, which is real. They screen you in terms of your experience, your background. They give you tests, and I passed and became a scribe. And that was a couple of years ago. And in the time since, I'm now working on my 9th book for Scribe.
Wow.
That is the journey.
That is the journey. I love it. So I have to ask, I want to ask about the tech startup because you went from newsroom, newspaper reporter, publisher, editor, then publisher, and then into that kind of management side, which you said you failed. You didn't fail. You just learned. You learned maybe what you weren't good at, possibly. Um, what was the tech startup? What was like the mission or the vision of the tech startup that you went into?
We set out to solve the problem of local newspapers. We set out to create a tech platform that would sort of reinvent local news and information. Um, we, we were newspaper friendly. We thought that if we created a platform that many newspapers, but also content creators and communities could share to everyone's benefit, that it would help newspapers reestablish themselves as sort of the hub of information in a community. Um, and we found that newspapers didn't really want to play with us. We found that it's a difficult nut to crack to make the internet, a news and information website, work financially at the local level. And we learned a lot. I had a lot of fun. I mean, there's as you know, a fundamentally different way of thinking when you work in tech and when you work at a startup, where it's all about testing and measuring and learning and iterating as quickly as you can and taking chances, and recognizing that when something fails, if you fail fast, it's a good thing. So that I really enjoyed that aspect of it, but ultimately we couldn't crack the nut, and eventually ran out of runway, uh, and shut down.
Interesting. What role did you play in that tech startup?
I was a co-founding employee. I um, had my hand in almost everything: product development, testing, working to develop a blogger network, training freelance writers, ironically, to write what are called content marketing posts for businesses, a different form of advertising. Um, Participating in what was a very collaborative decision-making environment. I worked with other writers. I worked with developers. I worked with. I sold advertising. I did a lot of things, which is what you do in a startup.
Yeah, you do everything in a startup. It's chief cook and bottle washer all the way through everything. You do it all. So I would assume that then there all those lessons, the stuff you learned, the failures, the successes that came was a fantastic setup for going into freelance writing.
It was, and I mean, I was so happy when I found Scribe and when I got a role there, because most of their clients, although not all, are business people. And I think the combination of my uh, journalistic experience, my business experience, my tech experience really prepared me well to work with a real variety of the clients that Scribe has. And I love the core job. I mean, it's back to what I loved in the beginning. It's meeting interesting people. It's asking them questions. It's listening to them carefully, and it's helping them tell their story. So it's been, from my point of view, a match made in heaven.
That's fantastic. So speaking of match, what was the match like on your end? Like, how does the match type work on yours? I'll tell it how I'll explain how it was on my end. But when you were, well, let me just ask that. What's the match process on your end when they bring a quote unquote book to you or an author to you? How does that work?
It just changed, actually. At the time you and I began working together, um, Scribe would post all the available incoming authors, along with some information about them, the book they intended to tell, their background, and so forth. And you would bid on projects you were interested in, not in the sense of bidding to do it for a certain number of hours or for a certain number of dollars, but simply explaining your interest. I want to work with this person because, and here's what I would bring to it. And they would make, they would weigh the people who had expressed interest and make their best call. Um, the volume of work that they've dealt with has increased dramatically over the past couple of years. And recently, they changed their process, I think, to try and make it more efficient. And they're now taking into consideration what the author, the client, is looking for, what scribes are available, what their background is, and they're asking you if you're interested in work. Taking, they're going to the scribe and saying, "Here's a project we think you're well suited to. Would you like to take it on?" I have not gone through that type of process, um, but they've adapted, and they've adapted. Scribe is a good startup. I mean, they're only 5 or 6 years old, I think, something like somewhere in that range, and they're still doing what startups need to do. They're adapting rapidly when circumstances change. So they're unafraid to try new things. And this is an example of that, where they just felt the need to adapt, um, to better manage the flow of clients and better match writers, scribes, and authors.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the pandemic opened up a ton of time for busy entrepreneurs, busy professionals. I mean, me being included. I mean, it was, whoa, this is a perfect time to write a book. If I was going to do it, this is the time. I'm not gone every weekend for soccer. I'm not gone every weekend for cheer and dance. I'm not all over the place. I'm here. I have the time to commit to this. So that's interesting, and it doesn't surprise me. I will say this, and I've said it in another podcast. The the experience on my end has been absolutely amazing for from start to finish on this book. And so it's not meant to be an advertisement for Scribe. It's more meant to be the story of how this has gone for me, and even the story of Mark for those of you listening. But if you're thinking about writing a book and you want to do it a little more efficiently, I will say, from an entrepreneur standpoint, this is a tremendous solution to consider. My side of it, when I came to Scribe on the match process, to share my side of it, my side on the match side was an initial screening, call. Do you even have a book in you, Gabe? Was the simple way I look at it. Once I made it past that stage, was all right, let's dig further. What do you think your book's going to be? Where do you want it to go? How do you want it positioned? Who is your ideal avatar? All of the things that you need to know, and even including the North Star. Where are we going? All of those things that we needed to know for the book, I went through and we detailed. And they came back to me and said, we have a few people that we think are qualified, but we have one that we think would be the best for you. And my question was, is okay, help me understand. They said the only thing is you can't have him for 4 more months or 3 more months. I can't remember what it was. It was either 3 or 4 more months. And I said, well, help me understand him. Tell me his story. And they did. They went to tell me your story. They then explained how I could look up your writing. I could find the things that you've done. I went to your website. I did everything. But the thing that got me was the most important question that I asked and also learned was, is he a solopreneur? So that he would understand a lot of the things that I'm talking about. And the answer was yes. You having moved your way into the freelance writing piece put you into the experience of and the mindset of what happens to a solopreneur when they go on their own, how this all works. And it was an amazing match. And yeah, that was an interesting way. I didn't know how it worked on your end. I just knew how it worked on my end. So it's interesting.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because in making my bid, I said the very same thing from my side of the screen. I said, I am a solopreneur. I'm facing the issues that Gabe's readers are facing, and that his job is solving, or helping his clients solve. And I also said I'm actually approaching retirement. And so I have a particular interest in working with someone whose business is helping people get there. So my interest was also, it just felt like, oh yeah, this is a book I'd love doing. So and I did.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah, it was a fantastic experience, like I've already said. So help me understand then, how does the process work once we were matched? Because there's a relationship building phase, there's a communication phase, there's an outlining phase. Can you walk us through that process so people can get an understanding how that works?
So you're quite right that establishing a relationship, which really is about just coming to trust each other and understand each other, is sort of the underlying work to be done early. It never stops, but it's the underlying work to be done early. You mentioned the North Star, and you and I worked together on that, and it is a document, but it's well thought out. It has a set of questions that we discussed together, I think, in our first call. It's either our first or second call. And as you said, to begin with, what's the basic idea for your book? Uh, what's the audience you really need to reach with this book? What's a secondary audience you'd like to reach with this book? What does success look like for you? What kind of a voice do you want your book to have? And as you said, an avatar, when you think about who your primary audience is, let's actually put a name to that and let's describe them, which, as we'll get to, I think, became a kind of important element of your book. So those questions, which we then, I listened, I wrote them up, I shared them with you. We went back and forth perhaps, but that sort of gets us both on the same page, or got us both on the same page as to exactly where we were going. And you made it easy. You, from the beginning, have been extremely well prepared and thoughtful. And it flowed really well from the beginning. From there, you start thinking about, okay, so what is the book itself? And it begins at the highest level with, what are the themes you want to touch on? And that's kind of the building of a table of contents. Again, you were very well prepared for that. And that's really basically a label and a sentence, a single sentence to describe the themes you want to touch on. And they flowed, in your case, in a very natural order. But if they don't, that's something we'd work on together. And from that, you build, you really do begin to drill down into what each of those themes mean. And the way I've described it to people is, it's like you're trying to develop a PowerPoint presentation where you've got bullet points. So, one of your themes, which we'll talk about, was this begins with a life wheel, begins with understanding your life's goals and where you stand right now. So there was a chapter about that, and you kind of laid out the bullet points of just what that meant. What does that life wheel mean, and what does it mean? How do you actually fill in your wheel? And from there, a series of content calls follows, typically once a week, scheduled for a couple hours. They often take a couple hours, in which we use that, and you and I used that PowerPoint slide, excuse me, to walk through the call, to walk through the topics we needed to cover. And those calls are recorded, transcribed, and that puts me in a position, or a scribe in a position, to write with your actual voice recorded and written down. So the goal is to, I think you put it to me once, it's me, but better. It's to, all of us speak differently than we write. And it's about trying to help you tell your story in a polished way, but being true to both your story and to your voice. That's the goal. And to make sure we were getting there, as we content call built on content call, and we moved deeper and deeper into the book, I wrote 3 or 4 samples, 2-page at most, snippets really out of the call, and out of each call. So I think over the first month, I wrote 4 of them for you. And those were really intended not to, am I getting the story factually right? The focus of those is, how's the voice? Have I captured what you're looking for? If I haven't, let's hear some feedback so that I can try again the next time. And that is a very effective way, I found, to sort of hone in. By the time you're done the content calls and are ready to write, you should be, and I felt that I was, pretty confident in my feel for your voice and the kind of how you wanted your book written. And the next stage is I wrote the introduction, shared it with you. We made some tweaks. Um, and once you'd signed off on it, that yes, this is the tone, this is the spirit I'm looking for, I drafted the rest of the manuscript. An editor or a manuscript specialist internally at Scribe reviews it at several stages to give me feedback. If I'm struggling with anything, there's someone to back me up on that side, someone I can turn to who's an experienced editor. And then I send off the full manuscript to you. But it's nothing more than a first draft. Then the second phase of our working together, really equally as important as the first phase, was the revision phase. It's always different when you see something in writing. There's, there are certain things you might want to say differently. There are certain points that maybe you see the need for more elaboration. And we went through a similar process where we had regular calls marching through the book again and making the changes that needed to be made. And we tied things off at the end with sort of a time to pause, each read it through thoroughly, reconnect. And when you were ready, gave the thumbs up, off it went. And from there, it was out of my hands and into the production phase. That beautiful cover behind you. There's a marketing team. I mean, there's a whole alignment of people at Scribe who do the rest of the work. But that was the process that you and I followed.
Well, and I have to say, you've already said it. It was a fantastic experience as we've gone through. We had a great relationship. It started off really well. We did use the whole 2 hours every time, and as a good share of it, 10 or 15 minutes each time was, how's your family doing? How's this going? How's that going? Even got to meet one of your daughters who's in medical school. I mean, that's just fun. I think even some of my kids came in. I mean, it's just fun to have some of that happen and build that relationship. And I have to go back though to that little piece about voice. I have a mentor that helped me through the book. He's the one who told me about Scribe. He wrote a book with Scribe, and he's just like, man, he goes, you're way too busy. He goes, just hire somebody to get it done. They're going to do it better than you. But the thing you have to remember is they got to have your voice, but better. And that was where that came from. He goes, you want them to sound like you, but better. And you did. And I remember him asking me that again and again. Is it your voice, but better? I'm like, yeah, it is. It's like me. And the interesting thing is my wife read the whole manuscript before we sent it to the, it was a final approval and sent it in. She read it. She's like, man, that sounds like you. So you nailed it, man. It was awesome. Yeah.
The process really set us up for success, but so did your preparation. I mean, it's important. Your mind, you're methodical, and so you came to calls well prepared. We did often, typically, always catch up a bit in the beginning, and I enjoyed that. And it influences the book. I mean, the more we come to know each other, the better the book, in a sense, because part of the book typically is telling your own story, you telling your story, so that readers understand who you are and where you came from and what makes you tick. And the conversations we had about how each other's families doing were both enjoyable, but they also were informing our relationship and ultimately informing the book. So it all comes together, and but you're right. And you told me that in the beginning, you, in our first call, I remember you very deliberately set out to tell me about yourself, because it was important. It's important to the way you do business. I think it's probably important to you just naturally. And so we got off on a really good foot, I think. And yeah, it was always fun.
Yeah, I did that with the first call and the second call. Like in the very beginning, I'm like, you didn't understand who I am. And if this isn't a book, just tell me. I won't, I'm not gonna cry. I'm an adult. I'll move on. And so yes, I wanted to make sure that you understood who I was, because you're going to be writing in my voice and understanding who I am so that we can put that together. It brings me to a question. And my mentor told me that he had to do this. What happens when the connection isn't there? And someone writes and it's just not there. A couple revisions, still not there. What happens in the scribe world? Because we didn't have that happen. It was a great experience for us. What happens when it doesn't work?
Somebody needs to ask for help, and sometimes I'm sure it's the scribe who reaches out to that editor and says, I'm struggling, and other times it's the author who reaches out to their contact. There's somebody aside from the scribe who's, I think it's still called the project manager's role, but that's just what, or publishing manager, but that's just what their role is. They're responsible for seeing the whole train leave the station and arrive at its destination. And so if something goes wrong, it's their job to learn why and figure out how to adjust. In my experience, I've been asked to step in on 2 occasions when a match didn't work. And in both cases, it was really a matter of that chemistry, I think, of really getting on the same page, or the scribe bringing enough knowledge into the conversation to help really do the work to help the author tell the story as well as they could. So it just takes someone putting their hand up, and scribe deals with it. And it's not always smooth. I mean, not all the books I've worked on have been as smooth as ours was. But you learn to work, for the most part, I think the scribe and the author learn to work together. And I don't know what the percentage is, but I'm sure almost all the time the result is really good. But when it's not, that's what happens.
The other thing that I appreciated about the whole process is, and for anybody listen, I have no idea how to write a book. I had no clue how to write a book. What I knew was the ideas I wanted to get a hold of. I had the ideas I wanted to share. I had an outline of a book is all that I had. But what I didn't know is how to put it into a format that would be a good readable book. And that was one of the things that you brought to the table, was like, I'm starting to see the shape of this book. I'm starting to see, and you alluded to that a little bit ago, is to kind of talk a little bit about the shape of this book. And what we did is we started with a tip off of the book, kind of like a kickoff of the book, and that section. And I have another podcast that I walk through all of that, but you brought that to the table. Your experience was amazing in setting that up. So we have a 3-section book. The first part is just kind of, for lack of any other way to put it, is just getting your head right, getting your vision right, your goals, your habits, and then understanding of where you're going. And then we had a kind of like a planning section, and then we illustrated it with a case study. And that was your idea. I thought it was fantastic to then bring that to the table. And so I guess my question is was that a format that you had used in the past, or was that something that you had like, man, this will work here?
I had not used that format in the past. It's, and that case study grew out of the avatar, right? We gave him the name of Watt, which was my suggestion. And the reason it came to me was because that was the name of the founder of the tech startup I'd worked for. But his personality, his situation in life was your doing, drawn from, I think, your clients,
Mm-hmm.
the types of people you worked with. And it occurred to me partway through, as you said, the 3-part structure of your book, which you really brought to the table, the notion of understanding where you are in life and what your goals are, the financial planning process you build on top of that, and then the third part really is acting on it, carrying it through. It struck me in the process of working with you in the midst of those content calls that it was although there were examples that you share in the book, it might be useful to the reader to follow a single character from beginning to end. And so that every aspect of what you were talking about, the process you were describing, was illustrated in a fictional story, but which we made clear, but of an actual person, so you could sort of could sort of I thought it would help the reader grasp exactly what it was you were talking about and what it actually means in terms of the choices that a solopreneur would make as they walk through these stages. So that was a really good example of an idea that just emerged in the course of our working together. It wasn't something we set out to do at the beginning, but as we talked, it sort of rose as an idea, and you leapt on it. And I do think it added a lot to the book in the end.
Yeah, I really do too. I think it was great. So one of the questions that is going through my mind is, what were some of the things that you learned in the process? I would bet that, because you get to talk to people writing books from industries that you maybe know or don't know, but what are the neat things that you learned in this process? And even if you've learned other things in other processes, and what are some of those things that you could share kind of from your benefit as a ghostwriter?
Um, Let me start with the overall process of the books I've worked on, and then come down to yours. I've worked with a real array of people. Uh, I've worked with a trial lawyer, personal injury lawyer, whose mom was killed tragically in an accident, and who was overwhelmed by the circumstances that unfold in those cases, even though he'd been working with people like that for decades, and wanted to honor his mother by writing a book to help people who find themselves in that tragic circumstance. Fascinating. Uh, I worked with uh, a Google executive who had very different ideas about digital marketing and how to go about doing that. Uh, I worked with a documentary filmmaker um, about his own personal journey through trauma and psychedelic treatment with psychedelic drugs. So it's just quite an array. And in every one of those books, I learned, a lot that I didn't know before. And that's maybe the best fringe benefit of doing this work, is just the experience of meeting very interesting people like you and learning from them and getting paid to do it. It's a pretty terrific arrangement. In your book, um, I think the most the take what I learned that has meant the most to me is the grounding, the way you ground your work with clients and your guidance in the book in an understanding of where you are in life and where you want to be, and everything else flowing from that. And uh, it just makes so much sense. And the way you went about it was very specific and therefore very actionable. And I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about that. I learned about specific choices you could make and how to structure your business and the consequences they'd have. Um, and I learned some seemingly very simple, but things that we weren't doing about how to actually make the plan work. You know, how to set up discrete accounts, say, and set aside certain amounts of money to achieve certain goals down the road. Um, so really, I learned something from every aspect of what you teach. Um, but I think the part that I still reflect on the most is what you call the life wheel.
Yeah. I remember the first time I saw the life, I was like, oh my gosh, this thing's amazing. I have to start using it with my clients, because I mean, it has nothing to do with money, but it has everything to do with money. It has nothing to do with financial planning, but it has everything to do with financial planning, especially for solopreneurs who are on their own going, oh my gosh, I have got 8 million plates in the air. How do I handle all this?
Yes.
Yeah. What do I need to have as a guide?
Yes.
Yeah. Really interesting. Very interesting. So any other thoughts about the process of going through, and one question that I guess that I have, I want to ask, and then if there's anything else regarding kind of the process that we went through together, and then I'll make that transition to those three famous money questions that I like to ask everybody. But so if someone is sitting out there that's a ghostwriter that's listening, all right, what are some of the lessons that you could share with that ghostwriter of why they might want to consider going down this road if they haven't gone down this road?
So from the writer's point of view, why they might want to consider this?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, freelance work is hard. You know, it's hard in the sense that it's hard to find consistent work. It can feel very much like and it is very much a up and down experience where all of a sudden there's too much work and you're overwhelmed, and then there are these gaps where there's no work, and you're anxious. And as a result, freelance writers, when I set out to try to do this, I talked to some people, friends of mine, who had become freelance writers and tried to learn. And that's one of the things they talked about consistently is it's just very difficult to um, to manage the flow of work, and you feel compelled to never say no because you're always concerned that there's going to be a trough around the corner and you need to pay your bills. And I found that I learned exactly what they meant by that in the first months before I came to work with Scribe. The beauty of working with Scribe and ghostwriting is it's it's a longer term proposition. You're spending months together, working on the book with the author, and working with a company like Scribe, excuse me, that is doing quite well and has a flow of clients means that there's plenty of work, and you don't have, so it removes a lot of that anxiety, and it enables something that matters to me. And I suspect to many freelance writers is it lets you get deeper into a subject. If you're being paid to write an article and you're only being paid a flat fee, from a financial point of view, there's only so deep you can go. You've got to move on to the next project. And that can be frustrating. This, because of its long-term nature, because of the complexity of the project, I find that very satisfying. And if, a writer has experience, as scribe writers do, the ability to work on something more complex is satisfying. The long-term nature of it and the depth you can get to is very satisfying. The relationship you develop is great. And there's something very, very rewarding in helping someone who has a story to tell it. I think good stories make the world a better place, either because of the information they impart or the pleasure they give, or both. And there's something really rewarding in helping someone who, you mentioned it. They're anxious too. They're wondering, do I actually have a book? Can I actually pull this off? I don't know what the heck I'm doing. I don't know how to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So most authors I've worked with approach the process with some level of anxiety themselves, and helping people overcome that and find, oh yeah, I do have a story to tell, is actually rewarding as well, because everybody does have a story.
Yeah, we all have stories.
We all have stories, and the more people who tell their stories, the better. We love stories. It's how we understand the world. So there's something very rewarding, about bringing. I've helped a lot of people tell stories in a fairly short time because the scribe process is so well structured, and that feels good.
That's fantastic. That is fantastic. So I'm going to make the transition. This is a podcast about money, and we have 3 questions I'd love to ask everybody about money. And so, Mark, what's the smartest thing you've ever done regarding money?
Listen to my wife. And I mean that very sincerely, because we have very different temperaments. I'm impulsive. I'm always, willing to step off the curb into traffic. I'm the person who's inclined to do crazy things. Brenda is very, by temperament, very cautious, very prudent, very conservative with money. So from the beginning, we've had a household budget. From the beginning, we've saved money. And even though we never made a lot of money in our lives, because of listening to Brenda, we're fairly well positioned at this stage in life. So far and away, that's the best financial decision I've ever made, is recognizing that I'm not the person who should be making the financial decisions. And, being fortunate enough to have a partner who um, complemented my mindset with one that was built on wisdom as opposed to impulse.
That's great. That is really good. How about the other side? What's the biggest money mistake you've ever made?
Tempting to say the times I don't listen to Brenda, but I think it was losing track of my life wheel in my 50s and taking a job that paid more money, um, in part because of the responsibilities and the ability to influence things at a different level, but in part because of more money, that led us to sell a house we had built, move, sell the house at a bad time in the market. So sell it actually at a loss, given the money we invested in it. Buy a house, we had paid off our mortgage. We had to take on a mortgage again. Ultimately left that line of, that was ultimately stepped away from the business at that point, sold that house at a loss, and moved back to the town that we had left behind into another fairly modest home, actually in a better location. Have now paid that mortgage off too. It all ended up just fine. The extra income I made in those years helped get kids through college. The experiences I had in those years um, opened different doors. I don't regret the decision, but it set us back, at least in terms of homes. It uprooted us. And the root of it, was not was the life wheel, was not recognizing what really mattered most to me. Um, came to me eventually in part because I got very sick at one point, had a life-threatening cancer, um, of which I'm a long-term survivor, and very grateful for. But that was the experience that sort of awakened me to, wait a minute. What are the real priorities? So I would say the root of it was losing track of the life wheel.
Very good. Very good. So, what does mastering your finances mean to you?
um, at this stage in life, it means, for both Brenda and me together, being able to live life on our terms. And, it doesn't mean traveling the world. Someday we might. It doesn't mean having a second home, because we live in a beautiful place in the woods in New Hampshire. What it means is, for Brenda, in her early 60s, she worked in the medical profession. She was a dietitian. She was really burned out. I mean, the work had gotten hard in terms of the burden, how much work there was, and the pace at which she had to work. It really wore on her. She needed to step away. And I was still working, but we had the wherewithal to say we could go down to one income and we'd be okay. But it still, for me, meant I'm willing to work longer than she is, to help make this happen, but only if I can work on my terms. And for me, what that came to mean through Scribe was working part-time rather than full-time and still paying the bills. It meant working from home instead of an office, which was handy when the pandemic came.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it meant sort of it meant coming back to writing, which, is what I've always loved most. Um, and it meant sort of being in control of my glide path as I also head toward retirement. So we, because of Brenda's decisions and values, we were able to amass savings sufficient, um, for us to approach the retirement phase, and in Brenda's case, so far embark on it, when we needed to or wanted to. And to us, that's mastery.
Oh, it's tremendous mastery. That is mastery to allow you to retire on your terms, allow you to transition on your terms, which then comes all the way back down to the thing that I always talk about, which is freedom. You had the freedom to make choices because of decisions and planning and mastery that you guys did before. So you guys have done a fantastic job. Very impressive. Nice job.
Thank you. I owe it all to Brenda, and it was all reinforced by you. So thank you too.
Well, yes, tell her thank you when you get home. Yes. So so Mark, this has been fantastic. If anybody wants to find you, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
I do have a website. It's authormarktravis.com. That's author is in the author of a book, all one word, authormarktravis.com. And there is contact information on that.
Fantastic. That is great. Is there anything else you would like to share?
Not really.
All righty.
I think you did a great job of interviewing. So
well, I appreciate that. So, Mark, I really appreciate you being on this episode of Solopreneur Money. Thank you.
I enjoyed it. It was great to spend time together again.
Well, Solopreneurs, Gabe here. Thank you for listening. I truly appreciate you taking the time to hear this episode. I've got 3 main takeaways from this episode. 1, you do have a story in you. 2, there are people out there like Mark who can write it for you and actually sound better than you think you can, which is actually kind of funny because that's what really happened with me. And the last thing is it's a really rewarding experience. As you could tell by listening to that, we had a great relationship throughout the process. I enjoyed the process all the way from start to finish. And it's really rewarding, not only in the relationship that you build, but the rewarding pieces of what comes with your business. And spreading your story throughout the world with a book is still one of the greatest accomplishments that people have for themselves. So my call to action is this. If you decide that you want to write a book, go to scribe.com and tell them Gabe sent you, and take your opportunity to see if your story's out there that you can go share with the world. Thanks a lot for listening, and have a fantastic day.